Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes. It's the 4th of August and I'm Cindy Yu, the broadcast editor at The Spectator. The Tory leadership contest is now Liz Truss's to lose. Is the writing on the wall? I'll be speaking to Katy Balls and the historian Robert Toombs. I'll also be joined by the pollster John Curtice to chat about the power of polling. Next, Beijing is having a tantrum over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. I'll be speaking to Taiwanese journalist Brian Hioe in Mandarin about the view from Taipei. I'll also be joined by the historian Rana Mitter, who writes this week's cover article on China's impending baby bust. Its young are simply not having enough babies. What does this mean for the future of Chinese power? And from China to Russia, are sanctions working? I'll be joined by Dr. Richard Connolly to discuss. And finally, instead of think tanks, why don't we have theft tanks? The Spectator's Wikiman columnist Rory Sutherland will be on the show. A Spectator subscription is now better value than ever before. As a new subscriber joining today, you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel? Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Another week, another set of polls showing Liz Truss way ahead of Rishi Sunak. Though this week saw her first blunder over the pay of public sector workers across the country, will anything turn the Liz Truss tide? I'm joined by Deputy Political Editor Katy Balls and the historian Robert Toombs. Katy and Robert, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Katy, can you update viewers on what's happened in the Tory leadership campaign over the last week? Because it does look like Liz Truss is the one with the momentum, with a number of cabinet endorsements over the last 7 days.
Yes, it was still technically in the early stages of the Tory leadership campaign. The victor, the new Prime Minister, is not announced till early September. But this week the ballots are going out, slightly delayed due to security concerns. And there is an expectation amongst some MPs, but not all, that members will vote fairly quickly. When you're looking at the polling, Liz Truss seems pretty far out in front. The YouGov poll, Conservative Home poll, all pointing to a really big lead. But Rishi Sunak's supporters and his campaign team are saying that when they look at the polls, it doesn't actually correlate to what they're hearing on the ground. They think it's much closer than this. Now, of course, they would say that because it's in their interest to make it seem as though this race is not a done deal. But I think it is just worth bearing in mind how tricky it is to poll the membership. And that's why we have to, with all these different factors at play, I think that by far the bookies' favourite right now is Liz Truss. It feels as though the most likely situation by some margin is that she is the next Prime Minister, but it is not over till it's over.
Robert, how do you feel about Liz Truss's head start here? Because you had written for The Spectator before that you were endorsing Kemi Badenoch, but obviously she's no longer in the race.
Yes, quite so. Yes, I do hope that Liz Truss will be chosen. I'm not a party member, so I have no say in the matter, but I think partly because of what she said, partly because of what she's done, and not a little because of who supports her and who doesn't. And the people I tend to trust support her, and the people whom I'm not quite so willing to trust tend to be against her. That's the best I can do, I'm afraid, as an outside observer. That's what makes me form my view.
Are you not a little bit cynical about the cabinet endorsements that have gone to her in the last few days, and the non-cabinet ones? People like former rivals Tom Tugendhat, Penny Mordaunt, Sajid Javid. You know, when you say people who support her, it does seem like a lot of ambitious politicians who support her.
Yes, I'm quite cynical, as everyone else is. But of course, not everyone is supporting her because they think they'll get a job. It's some of the people I'm thinking of are people who are not likely to get cabinet posts, won't mention any names, and also, of course, people outside the House of Commons who support her too. And I mean, the things that count for me are to some extent the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think this has become partly a symbol and also something of real importance. And it seems clear that Rishi Sunak is drawing back from trying to resolve this question, and Liz Truss seems to be willing to take the bull by the horns. And I think that the protocol has become really a sort of acid test for attitudes to Brexit, not whether you're for it or against it, but what you think it really means in practice, and whether you think you should push ahead or try to limit the effects. And I think Liz Truss clearly thinks that you have to go for being more than just another Norway.
And Katy, speaking of pushing ahead with Liz Truss, I mean, that does seem like it embodies her entire campaign, her entire personality. You write in The Spectator this week about her foreign policy, which is very much pushing ahead. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, a part of that is the Northern Ireland Protocol, as we just heard, and the fact she does take a more bullish approach. I think Rishi Sunak is far more concerned about the risk of sparking a trade war with the EU during a cost of living crisis, whereas Liz Truss, as she said in the hustings this week, feels that the only thing the EU really recognise is strength and force, and therefore you have to be bold in your approach. I also think it's worth noting when Liz Truss gave her first party conference speech as Foreign Secretary, she didn't mention the EU once, which I think gives you a sense, I would say, of her priorities when we're talking about her foreign policy, because what she has pioneered during her time in the Foreign Office, having been appointed last September, is effectively this idea of a network of liberty. That's what she refers to it as, her supporters do. And I think when it comes to how she views the world, it's pretty black and white in the sense of, do you support liberty and freedom or are you against it? And I think that dictates how she wants to work with countries, whether that is on security, alliances, or even trade.
Well, I was very encouraged by Katy's article because I think the world has changed very much since 2016. Then we were thinking that our foreign policy was dominated by our relations with the EU. But I think what's happened in the last year or more, less than a year, is that we've come to realise that the EU is not really a source of strength, is not a source of security, and is not really a viable partner. And an ambitious global policy, which at first looked like just words, seems to me now, and I thought this is what I drew from Katy's article, is really something that we have to do. Our security and our trading interests push us in that direction. And I think that Liz Truss, if she can do it, at least has that vision.
Robert, very finally and briefly, is there anything that Rishi Sunak can do to persuade you to go to support him, at least in principle, even if you don't have a vote? Or do you think his greatest opportunity are with the undecided Tory voters?
Well, I think he's the candidate of the undecided, and in a way, he's the candidate of the non-Tories, and not. I don't mean this as a criticism of him. I think from all I know of him, he's a man of intelligence, honesty, charm, all the rest, and I think has a lot to offer. But I think he is the orthodox candidate, and he, above all, has become the candidate of Treasury orthodoxy. And I think that this is not what we want at the moment. And I think some of the language he uses is rather talking down to the electorate. Talking about the nation's credit card and that sort of thing. That's not how the economy works. And I think that his insistence on an orthodox retrenchment policy as we're heading into a probable recession is simply the wrong and the most dangerous thing that one could do. But I think it's typical of the Treasury's attitude over the years.
Robert Toombs and Katy Balls, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. So let's take a look at those polls then. A recent YouGov one had the Foreign Secretary 40 points in front of Rishi Sunak, while another said the difference was just 5 percentage points. Are the pollsters missing something? And are there any signs of Rishi Sunak catching up? I'm joined now by Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Professor John Curtice, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, let's start with a straightforward one. Why is there such a discrepancy between the different polls?
Well, we'd like to know the answer to that question, Cindy. The two organisations did their polling somewhat differently. YouGov, of course, have this quite substantial panel of people who are willing to answer their polls. Almost inevitably, one of the difficulties with running such a panel is that you're more likely to get people who are interested in politics to participate in them than those who are not. One of the things that YouGov, amongst others, have been trying quite hard to correct in recent years, because that can be a disadvantage when it comes to a general election. If you've got people who are more likely to turn out and vote, then you may underestimate some of the differences in turnout. And that was certainly part of the story behind the problems that the polls had back in 2015. But the upside, of course, is that it does mean that you are much more likely to have members of political parties.
And John, we think of polls as these things that measure voting intent, but with the polls coming out during the race, it surely has an influence on how the race is panning out as well. For example, the polls that we've just been talking about, they lend this air of inevitability towards Liz Truss's victory, and presumably that influences whether it's other MPs or other voters into backing the winning course.
Well, I'm talking about voters in general. The research that's been done on this will tell you that for every occasion that you can pick up a so-called bandwagon effect of people piling in behind the party that's ahead, you can find another one where there's an underdog effect where people seem to pile in the opposite direction.
Right.
Of course, we're not talking here about a polling of the general public. We're talking about a small audience, and where the outcome is going to affect people's careers inside the Conservative Party. And I suppose what is notable is that even though Liz Truss in the end only just scraped onto the ballot, if she does win this contest, I think she's going to be as low as anybody's been in terms of the share of the supportive MPs at the final stage of the MPs process. But despite that, all of the announcements we have got since from senior MPs, including those who either took part or had hoped to take part in the leadership ballot, have all been coming out in favour of Liz Truss. Now, not for me to impugn the motives of those who've done this. Doubtless they are telling us what they, in their judgment, is indeed the best thing for their party and indeed for the country. But shall we say, if you were wanting to keep open your chances of being in Liz Truss's new cabinet, then such statements perhaps may not be regarded as unhelpful towards your career progression. And to that extent, at least, clearly it can make a difference to the way in which MPs react. And I think it's also true that some of Rishi Sunak's tactics have been affected by the polling. The way in which he tried quite clearly to try to see if he could steamroller, put Liz Truss on the back foot in the BBC debate, something which in the end for some people came across as rather too aggressive and mansplaining. I think that almost undoubtedly was saying, what I've got to try to do here is to persuade people that I am actually more effective as Prime Minister, more competent, which indeed is one of the attributes, one of the very few attributes on which even in the current polling, Rishi Sunak does score relatively well. So again, tactics of the candidates can be mapped. It does, of course, perhaps raise the question, given that Liz Truss is apparently so far ahead, as to why she has carried on making so many policy announcements, with therefore the risk that you make one that leads you into trouble, which clearly happened to her this week with the announcement about regional pay boards. Once you're ahead, just stick to your message. The narrative is working. The narrative that I am the empathetic, ordinary girl who grew up in Paisley and Leeds and went to comprehensive school, and I'm opposing this posh boy from Winchester. It's a narrative which we can question, but it's a Johnsonian style narrative in terms of its effectiveness with the Tory membership, together with, of course, addressing the angst inside the Conservative Party about the fact that it's found itself presiding over high levels of spending and high levels of taxation, is projected to do so into the near future. She's addressing that angst. She has found a picture way of selling herself to certainly the right of her party, therefore, in the end, why does she need to make more policy announcements? She doesn't need any more policy announcements. She just needs to keep on sticking to her current tune, because that current tune is one so far that Rishi Sunak has not been able to significantly counteract.
Fascinating. Professor John Curtice, thank you so much. Away from the Tory leadership contest, something huge is happening across the world. Beijing is in the middle of a temper tantrum, carried out with missile launches and jets flying over the Taiwan Strait. All of this triggered by Congress Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island, a trip that the White House advised against. So, what is the situation like in Taiwan now? I'm joined by Brian Hioe, editor of New Blue magazine in Taipei. 邱启新，欢迎来到 SpectatorTV。首先，我想问的是，这一周是个国际都在关注台湾的时刻，但是你人在台北，你在那边的气氛是感觉是什么样子的？
其实我觉得很多国际媒体报道台湾，好像新闻都在紧张，然后大家都很慌。可是我觉得其实还好，我觉得目前还没有什么太大的反应。我觉得应该是看这几天，因为像这些军事的事情才今天才开始 ，Pelosi 是这几天前才来的。可是我觉得其实 Pelosi 到台48小时前才有人开始注意到这件事情，因为我觉得一般人可能没有那么在关注政治，所以他当天来的时候，其实有人去机场这样子，应该是200个人去，有一些是支持的，有一些是反对的，比较多是支持的。然后他的饭店是在台北，那个 Grand Hyatt 也是有蛮多人去的。可是我觉得之前好像就那48小时才有人才开始注意到，好像国际媒体一直在讨论这件事情已经几个礼拜了。
对，我就觉得很好玩，这一个国际舆论和台湾舆论的这个差别。这是不是显示了一个大家都有的问题，无论是美方还是中方，就是说没有看到台湾人的这种观念，没有给台湾人这种话语权。比如说 Pelosi 这一次的这个访问，台湾人有话语权吗？
所以其实我觉得这个问题了，因为我觉得很多新闻报道不是台湾人在写的，在英文或是当然是有些台湾人在写用英文的媒体报道，可是我觉得很多次是没有被注意到，然后其实很多次是上面的人这样编辑作为反对这些，真的是这样子吗？不可能吧，大家应该是蛮害怕的，所以我觉得有这个问题。然后其实我觉得好像这件事情是被讨论，就是说中国跟美国的看法会讨论到台湾人自己的观点，所以我觉得这个从以前其实报道这种两岸关系的一些新闻，我觉得有好一点，可是我觉得这次还是很明显，就是台湾人的声音是不是有一点被忽略了。
那你觉得台湾人对这个事件的更放松，或者至少不是那么紧张的看法，是不是因为已经习惯了中国大陆这种样子的纸老虎的这种威胁？
没错，我觉得最近很多年都是这样子的。然后这种什么其实中国威胁台湾也不是新的事情。我觉得当然这次反应比较大，可是我觉得也只是刚开始的。我觉得应该是看自己会不会有什么改变，有什么其他的反应会出现。因为我觉得目前就是好像是大家蛮习惯的事情啊，中国说话，有些就是一些发言，可是可能没有做到什么。然后我觉得这次就是要看这几天，你只是这些像比如说今天好像没有什么大事情发生，是明天或后天或是礼拜天会不会有什么变化？
那你觉得有可能会到下一周吗？延续到那段时间吗？
其实我觉得有可能啊，因为我觉得中国可能还有一些其他反应，然后可能是经济方面的，像一些措施，像比如说禁止一些台湾的一些进口，像比如说Grouper 啊，或是凤梨啊这些过去有的。其实他们那些措施也是要看一下，会想影响到台湾哪一些产业，很多就是农民或是渔业。然后这也代表着中国想要透过哪一些项目来影响到台湾，或是哪一些产业来用经济的方式影响台湾。然后我觉得也就是跟政治有关了，因为现在就是大家都在看选举了，就是过几个月就会选举，所以中国这几个月做的事情可能会影响到选举。然后如果其实他们威胁台湾的话，也就是可能导致民进党就会是胜利了，然后大概可能会有些负面影响对国民党，所以我觉得这也是另外需要注意的事情。
对。那你觉得这次蔡英文怎么样子处理这个事件呢？你觉得他处理得到位吗？
其实我觉得蔡英文这次比较低调一点，一直知道如果太把这个弄太 public 一点的话，可能中国的反应会更大。然后也知道 Biden 跟 Pelosi 有些不同的看法，或是有些矛盾，可能有些矛盾。然后这是台湾当然就要跟两边都好了，所以我觉得中国不能站在 Pelosi 这边或 Biden 这边，所以蔡英文至少像比较低调，也没有什么公开说是想要 Pelosi 来或说反对。还有一些新闻报道说，其实台湾不是很想要 Pelosi 这次来，可是他还是坚持要来。这个是没有真据的，所以这不是很确定，可是有可能。然后如果这样子的话，真的也是代表台湾其实没有办法反对美国政治要来台的这些要求，然后这也可能就是影响到台湾。你如果中国有个大反应的话，当然就是台湾卡住在这边。
但是无论如何，在西方，很多人都认为，这一次的访问是应该的，是一个好事情，因为中共越来越威胁，人们就觉得西方越来越应该支持台湾，这样子的话，但是从台湾的角度来说，你觉得这一次对台湾有没有什么利益，有没有什么实际上的好处？因为这个问题是一个记者在星期三问佩洛西的，然后当时我觉得他的答案没有真的回答这个问题。
对，没错，因为其实我觉得大部分是 symbolic 了，然后这可能也就是 Pelosi 他的目的也比较跟美国国内的选举有关，像是代表他自己是代表着民主党也是反对中国，反而反对才会支持台湾。像之前 Pompeo 就是川普下面的 Secretary of State 也是有来台湾，所以这也只是代表共和党觉得台湾是一个他们现在是蛮在乎这议题了，所以我觉得 Pelosi 来台湾也可能是这个原因。其实台湾有什么好处，就是可以表达美国支持台湾在这方面，可是还是可能没有什么具体的利益了。然后我觉得这可能也是有些问题的。现在所以中国这次有那么大的反应，你可能会影响到台湾，你可能会是害一些事情发生，所以其实我觉得是蛮难说的。对，可是像因为这个原因，我觉得就是这次蔡英文才会那么低调。
对，我觉得在讨论这件事件的时候，就总是觉得台湾被对待成一个政治足球，就是不只是中国把台湾对待成一个棋子，美国也是这种样子的，甚至美国内政利用台湾来各种政治家用他们自己的目的，英国这边我觉得也是同样的。那在这种情况当下，你觉得是什么样子的方法对台湾来说是最好的呢？美国是不是应该更考虑到台湾人的目的？就是说，比如说最近白宫Biden 手下。没有人确定这个战略模糊还是不是一个 strategy， 所以你觉得我想问的就是说，西方到底应该怎么来为台湾来保护台湾？
其实我觉得可能比较低调一点，然后不要那么公开的。像如果其实 Pelosi 已经到台湾，然后才是被公开说他已经在台湾，这可能没有那么大的反应。然后这是 Biden 我觉得不应该那么公开的跟 Pelosi 有一些只说他不同意他来台湾所以我觉得看情况。然后我觉得这一次好像这边是太大的新闻了，如果就是没有那么高调的话，这可能不会引起什么。像我觉得这是一个蛮难的问题了，因为我觉得很多次美国说支持台湾，也只是因为他们自己内部有一些政治的考量。然后中国其实有时候还在威胁台湾，他们其实想要表达的是给美国，不太是台湾。所以我觉得这是台湾的卡住在中间，然后这是台湾的情况，已经长期以来都是这样子。然后其实它有什么出路嘛，我也不是很确定。
邱其兴，谢谢。China may, for now, be throwing its weight around Taiwan, but will it be able to boast great power status for much longer? Professor Rana Mitter writes in this week's cover piece that China is facing a baby bust. Its population growth has dropped by 94%, and it could soon fall behind India as the world's most populous nation. What will this mean for the future of Chinese power? Rana joins me now. Rana Mitter, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, your cover article this week is all about the baby bust that China is imminently facing. It's got only 500,000 net births last year compared to about 8 million a decade ago. I mean, all of this is deeply ironic for a country that's so obsessed with population that it introduced the one-child policy. So, is that the policy, is that the reason that this is happening at the moment, or are there other reasons for what we're seeing as such a drastic demographic change?
Well, Cindy, you're right to say that this is a story that in some senses has been with us for a while, but its importance has only suddenly come upon us. And one of the reasons for that is that essentially there's a series both of short-term and long-term things that have made China one of the countries with one of the most serious demographic crises in the world in terms of the number of young people being born and growing up is becoming much, much smaller in number, and the number of older people who have to be supported by that younger generation is growing larger. The one-child policy that you mentioned is probably the single most important reason that this demographic decline is so steep. And just a reminder that basically it was in the late 1970s that the government introduced a policy that essentially forced the vast majority of the Chinese population to have only one child. There were some exceptions in the rural areas for certain ethnic minorities, but overall it was one child and that was it. Boy or girl didn't matter. And as a result, China has turned into a society which historically is almost unique in that there's a whole generation, 2 generations of people without brothers, without sisters, and therefore by extension without uncles and aunts. So that is very unusual. And of course that has led in large part to the realization in the 2010s that actually the success of the policy, in quote marks, the fact that population has shrunk by so much has now led to a very different problem, which is the baby bust that's on the Spectator's cover this week. But there are a couple of other factors that are more comparable to other societies, and they weigh in as well. And I'd say the quickest way to understand that is to look at the neighbors in East Asia, the neighbors of China. That's Taiwan, that's Japan, that's South Korea. Those other countries have also been undergoing a really severe demographic decline. Japan, by some counts, might be the first country, if you extrapolate an absolute straight line, to have no citizens at all in slightly more than 100 years' time, although I think it won't happen in a literal sense. But the difference is those countries essentially got to that much lower demographics through a more natural means. They never had a one-child policy. It's just that they got rich during the 1970s and 80s, became amongst the most prosperous societies on earth, and as a result, their populations became middle class, became relatively satisfied with their consumer lifestyles and decided, well, one child is enough, or in some cases, even fewer, just not to have any children at all. And in some ways, as I also say in the article, the China of today, at least in its middle class, has got to a stage when a lot of people actually think that one child maybe is enough, and even if the state wants you to have more, the individual living in perhaps a crowded apartment with a job and a lifestyle pursuit doesn't want more than one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that in my peers in China as well, who, like me, grew up I then had a brother later in life, but for much of my childhood, I was the only child. And to me, that was the normal thing. So then you grow up not thinking you want a big family. So I think that you're right to point out that normalization of expectations, part of what's contributing to this. I want to pick you up on this growing rich before you grow old phenomenon that you're talking about, because in your piece you point out that the per capita income of China is $12,500, whereas the same in Japan is $39,000. So, a third of the Japanese per capita income. And for me, as a Chinese person with family in China, that's concerning to me. Is China's economy going to slow, essentially? Is it ever going to be the biggest economy in the world if this happens?
Well, it's one of the things about the tyranny of numbers, you might say, Cindy, because it depends which direction you're looking. If you look west, if you're sitting in Beijing or Nanjing, I think you're a Nanjing native, if I remember correctly. If you look west, far west from where you are, to India, the only other country in the world that's got a single population in a single country that's in some ways comparable to China. And according to United Nations figures, may well next year, 2023, become the most populous country in the world. In other words, that'll make China number 2 population in the world for the first time since the Han Dynasty, which, of course, as you know, is more than about 2,500 years ago. Actually, slightly less, 2,200 years ago, let's say, for the heart of it. But
that's the
that
historian
comparison,
in you, Rana.
just having to make sure I kind of pick myself up there, about 220 BCE to about 220 CE. But let's stick to the present day with India. Now, India is a country that has per capita a GDP of less than half of China's. And for a lot of people in India, let's say it's $3,000 or $4,000 US dollars a year, they look at China and say, my goodness, how are these people managing to make $12,000 US dollars, $12,000 per capita per year? They see China as the great example to follow. But China, of course, isn't comparing itself with India, even though the population size is very similar. They're looking at the rich neighbors, Japan and South Korea. So there's a certain case of aspiration envy that's going on here as well. But the difference, I think, is this. In the case of China, you have to look, and this is what one of the things the article talks about, at the demographic shifts in the decades to come. And let's just hone in on one area, because it's an area actually that many of our UK listeners, and actually probably international listeners too, may pay attention to, and that's pensions. Now, we all know that around the world, people getting a decent pension has become more and more difficult for a whole variety of reasons. Spectator's finance pages have been very good about talking about it in the last few years. But in the case of China, there's a particular set of issues, which is that as there are fewer and fewer working age people, and of course those working age people are still part of that one child generation, because it only ended about 7 years ago, that policy. So the people who are growing under the permission for 2 and 3 children are still only children themselves. They're now having to support much larger extended families, parents, grandparents and so forth, than would be the case for their peers either in India or in Japan and South Korea. And that's one of the things that's very distinctively problematic from the point of view of China. There are some instant fixes, I mean, if they could bear to do it, which is to say raise the pension age from 50 to 55 for women, 60 for men. But in doing that, they might also find that they have, even in authoritarian China, people on the streets protesting that their pension rights, which were hard earned, are basically being snatched away from them to an older age. So even for the Chinese Communist Party with all its power, raising the pension age would not be a simple thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And Rana, as you point out in your piece, China's geopolitical power has so often been predicated on its population heft ever since the Han Dynasty, really. And in today's world, we can see the People's Liberation Army, that stat that's often bandied around about being the largest army in the world. Does it have military and geopolitical implications as well for China's population to be shrinking?
There are definitely military and geopolitical implications to this baby bust, the demographic crunch that we're seeing in China. I mean, as I'm speaking to you, in fact, today, Cindy, the day we're recording this, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, has just, in fact, left Taiwan, having visited there for a couple of days on a visit that's got China very angry. And the angry reaction has come in part from live firing of missiles into the sea just off the coast of Taiwan, carefully missing the coast, but only by a little bit. And there's a question about how far this military approach is sustainable over time as China's population gets smaller. Now, I think it's fair to say that China's leaders have been thinking about this in advance, because actually one of the things that's been happening really over the last decade is that China's total size of troop size, has been reducing. It was over 2 million people at one time, which definitely counted as the largest armed forces anywhere in the world. And that has been reducing, but still to pretty large 7-figure numbers. But what we've seen instead is the other thing that China is pushing towards, which is a much smarter type of technology that can be used for military purposes. So you might think about a future assault on Taiwan, possibly not being a D-Day style invasion, but a blockade with state-of-the-art warships, submarine warfare, or cyber warfare, these sorts of areas. The problem with that, which goes back to demographics, is that you still need lots of smart, younger people who are really savvy in that technology. And one of the things that I think is putting people off a bit, not yet kind of hugely noticeably, but I think it might change in future decades, is the people who they want to get, often young Chinese who've done PhDs at international universities and are bringing their scientific knowledge back to China. Well, a lot of these people are thinking, is this a country where really I can make myself a career? And the combination of the knowledge that future generations of Chinese workers, the young, are going to have to bear the price of paying for pensions for the old, combined with the increasing political crackdown on areas like the technology sector. It's become quite well known that big companies like Alibaba, for instance, run by Jack Ma, have found themselves in deep political trouble. These questions are being asked by young would-be entrepreneurs to say, well, actually, is this the place where I want to make the next part of my career? Now, let's not get it wrong. For quite a lot of young Chinese, this is still going to be a kind of new wonderland where they're able to invest, make a lot of money, and work on new technology. But there are more questions being asked by at least some of China's younger people about whether or not the society they're signing up for, getting older and perhaps getting more inward looking, is really the future they see for themselves.
And Rana, I can't let you get away without asking you this one final question, which is about Xi Jinping and the possibility of him renewing his third term. The Chinese economy is not doing very well. The government has quietly dropped its 5.5% GDP target, and the IMF says that the economy is more likely to grow only by about 3% this year. We talked about the housing crisis. President Xi surely has a difficult time on his hands. So is his position secure?
So I think we need to differentiate two things. In terms of, is Xi Jinping going to get a third term in office this October at the party congress? I think the answer is almost certainly still yes. I'd be very, very surprised if that weren't the case. But the linked question of, is there a different direction potentially possible for economic policy in China, which of course is at the heart of what's going on? I think that's much more likely. China's economy is not doing well in a whole variety of areas. We can see the property sector is really under pressure. A lot of big companies going bankrupt. Younger people, as I say, feeling reluctant to go into the employment market or worrying they won't get the right kind of jobs after training. There's this phrase again that's in the article that you know very well, Cindy, which is 毕业就失业.毕业就失业. You graduate, then you're unemployed. And these sorts of things might mean that he has to choose a prime minister to replace the current prime minister, Li Keqiang, who's more inclined towards an open market economy, entrepreneurship, and less towards really top-down political control. If that happens, then Xi Jinping will certainly still be the president and general secretary. But we might have to see a China that is pushed much more into opening back up to the world and realizing that simply cutting itself off in terms of a wholly enclosed economy is the kind of thing that might have happened back in the days of Chairman Mao, but in the 21st century, it's simply not possible.
Fascinating. Rana Mitter, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And if you've been enjoying the Spectator's content on China, do check out my podcast, Chinese Whispers. It's also on Spectator TV, so you can watch it as well as listen to it wherever you get your podcast from. Remember, if you enjoy what we do here at The Spectator, you can subscribe to the magazine and to our online content. To subscribe today, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. Now, the ruble looks strong, the Russian stock market looks like it's stabilised. So are Western sanctions on the Russian economy actually working? Owen Matthews argues that they are in this week's magazine, citing a new report from the Yale Management School. But I'm joined now by Dr. Richard Connolly, who says otherwise. He's an expert on the Russian economy. Richard Connolly, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, the question of whether or not sanctions on the Russian economy have been working is something that economists and Russian experts have been grappling with since the start of the invasion. There's a new report out from Yale Management School, which Owen Matthews writes about in this week's magazine. And it says, actually, despite Putin's hype, despite his myths, the Russian economy really is tanking, whether or not you look at the rubles, or whether or not you look at the stock market. What's your take on that report?
My interpretation is slightly different to that of Owen's. I found the Yale report to be a rather weak piece of work, and I'm choosing my words carefully there. It's written by some people who I didn't see as having any previous background in analysing what is in Russia, a very specific type of economy. It's also a study, I think, where the authors very clearly stated their commitment to advancing a very obvious political agenda, rather than presenting what I would consider to be something that's more required, which is a balanced, evidence-based assessment of what's taking place in Russia now. If you just look at the language of the report, there's lots of references to an economy that's imploding, calls for more sanctions, etc. And there's a lot of citation of some extremely biased sources. Now, that's not to say that some of what's contained in the report isn't accurate. Some of it is. I mean, they refer to the shrinking of Russian imports, some of the problems that Russia will face in reorienting gas exports from Europe to Asia. All of these are points that I'd agree with. But there's a lot that isn't. And that makes it quite difficult to take its overall conclusions too seriously. I think they overstate the extent to which the Russian economy is suffering at the moment, and in doing so overstate the likelihood of there being any change in the calculus in the Kremlin. I can give some examples of some of the errors that I think found their way into Owen's work, if you'd like. I'll just give two because there are many more. But one is on this question of gas, which is in the news at the moment. And one of the points made in the report is that Europe is much more important to Russia than Russia is to Europe on gas. And they present this in volume terms. They say, look, Russia's has only one really big customer, that's Europe. And Europe has a diverse range of other suppliers. That's true. However, the report doesn't go into the question of the price that Russia provides gas. And the fact is, Russia provides gas at a lower price than any of the other suppliers. So even though Europe's now buying more gas from America and from the Middle East, it's doing so at a much higher price. And that, if this stays like this over the coming years, is likely to mean you're going to see a big reduction in European industrial competitiveness. And that's, I think, a really serious, glaring omission in this report. The second glaring error is they talk about the cost of Russian oil, and they actually cite in support of their assertion that Russia is a high-cost oil producer a report that was paid for by Saudi Aramco ahead of its IPO from a few years ago. Now, this was Saudi Aramco trying to tell everybody, look, we do oil cheaper than anybody else, so look, Russia's very high. And this was an extremely biased report. If you speak to any sane person in the oil industry, including, I would imagine, the Saudis, they'll tell you that Russian oil is amongst the world's lowest cost in most of its oil fields. And so it's these two examples, I think, show you that there's some pretty egregious sourcing in the report. These are just two, I think, glaring examples, and there are many more. And they're examples of cherry picking of data that the authors of the report themselves accuse others of engaging in.
So, Richard, do you think that sanctions are not working then?
I think it's important to not conflate exerting an impact with causing a policy change, right? So I think if we look at Russia today, yes, it is affected by sanctions, undoubtedly, but not as much as this report suggests. I think in its zeal to make the point and to cherry pick data, this report does so in a rather unconvincing way. But what the report also doesn't do, and a lot of commentary that I see in the media doesn't do, is take into account the political economy of how sanctions tend to play out in authoritarian regimes. And in authoritarian regimes, of which Russia is one, the governments are very adept at making sure that even though the overall economic pie might be shrinking, that they allocate large shares of that shrinking pie to people who will support them, to the regime's closest supporters. So they reward those who are loyal to their leadership. You see juicy construction contracts given to insiders, privileged monopolies given to produce substitutes for sanctioned goods. All of these things keep workers in work, and they keep the pockets of elites lined. And as a result, it tends to mean that the regimes are actually quite durable, despite the fact that sanctions are exerting an effect. That's how authoritarian systems work. And sadly, that's why they don't tend to fold under sanctions. And we've seen this a lot of times in the past. South Africa in the 70s and 80s, North Korea and Iran and Yugoslavia more recently. And I'd say Russia since 2014 and, in my assessment, now and in the future.
That's fascinating. Richard Connolly, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, are we losing out on good ideas from abroad? Rory Sutherland writes in his Wikiman column this week that we need fewer think tanks and more theft tanks. To explain, he joins me now. Rory, welcome to Spectator TV. Now tell us, what is a theft tank?
Well, it's very simple. One of the things which business does, which it doesn't talk about very much, is we steal an enormous number of ideas. In other words, companies copy each other all the time. If they notice something that's successful elsewhere, without making much fanfare about it, they go and steal it. And it occurred to me that national governments in particular are extraordinarily bad at this. So one feature, for instance, of the American healthcare debate was at no point at all did anybody say, let's have a look at Canada, because even by the law of averages, okay, Canadians patently aren't dying in vast numbers on the streets. The Canadians are probably doing something right. I'm sure Canadians will tell you what's wrong with Canadian healthcare, but for example, in the price they pay for drugs, patently they've got something right, okay? But for some reason, it's considered unpatriotic, kind of not invented here, to admit to the fact that we're just stealing from elsewhere. Now, in the UK, we have a lot of countries, not only European countries. In fact, Australia, New Zealand, Canada are pretty good test beds for interesting ideas. I happen to notice, I went to Israel, and they had a law in Israel, which is that any company, any utility you ring, like the phone company, the water company, the energy company you ring, by law, if it doesn't answer your call within 30 seconds, it has to offer you the option of demanding a call back. And the return call has to come within 2 hours. Okay. Now, that was in Israel. Absolutely brilliant idea. We could steal that straight off. Okay, what a fantastic bit of legislation. In Germany, they're introducing legislation that when you subscribe to a newspaper, say online, like the Spectator, it has to be as easy to cancel your subscription as it is to instigate the subscription in the first place, to prevent this business where nobody will subscribe to anything because they're frightened of getting trapped in a direct debit that they can't kill. And the first thing I'd like to do is, instead of using dogma-driven think tanks, and the very business that a think tank tends to be left-wing or right-wing, tends to be a massive constraint on its ideas to begin with, because ideology is not a great way for generating originality. You know, you start off with a very narrow framework of how you think the world works, and all you're allowed to do is be we want to tax people more, we want to tax people less, rather than asking really imaginative questions about how do we tax people differently. And if you look at genuinely the whole history of human progress, much more of it happens through the transmission and spread of ideas than through the origination of ideas. And yet, I don't think, for example, in the United States, they still really haven't cottoned on to roundabouts or kettles. Okay, they speak the same language as us, but they're boiling water on a stove and they have the ridiculous four-way stop, which is provably vastly less effective than a roundabout. And yet again, that idea simply doesn't translate very quickly. And if you read books by Matt Ridley, there's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Sam Tatum, called Evolutionary Ideas. Most ideas aren't actually a flash of inspiration. They're the transference of an insight from one place to somewhere else. British food didn't get better because we made fish and chips better, okay? It got better because we stole loads of food from everybody else. And so I think it's a really important point. It's a kind of, theft is a kind of creativity. You repurposing a good idea in something closely related is still a form of creativity, but it's actually much more common and much more valuable than we realise.
Maybe it's because I'm not very ideological, Rory, but your idea sounds really good to me. I mean, I love the idea of picking all of these good things that happen around the world. But why do you think that it doesn't happen? It does seem pretty obvious now that you mention it.
I don't know. I think part of my little theory is that we have politicians who are, the choice of the next Prime Minister comes down to someone who studied PP at Lincoln College, Oxford, and someone who studied PP at Merton College, Oxford. And I wonder if there's a very big difference, I think, between practicing on the basis of theory and theorizing on the basis of practice. And I think most of these people now come into politics with an ideological framework, and they see, Dominic Cummings was always right about this. He said, in reality, real people, voters, are both much more right-wing and much more left-wing than politicians imagine. And the false dichotomy of left versus right on a whole load of debates actually focuses attention on where there is disagreement or where you can actually score points rather than on where you can make progress. Now, the great thing about business, of course, is even if you hate another guy, if you think you can make money together, there's an absolute incentive for you to collaborate and cooperate. That doesn't exist in politics.
Well, Rory, I do think that politicians are probably quite happy to work with people they don't personally like. If you just look at Penny Mordaunt's endorsement for Liz Truss this week. But speaking of the Tory leadership contest, do you see anyone in our political classes, whether they're running for Tory leader or in the political classes in general, as having fresh ideas?
I'm not entirely sure the person with fresh ideas should be the person leading the party, but to borrow Dominic's phrase of weirdos and misfits, I think there needs to be I think Sir Alfred Sherman performed this function a little bit with the Thatcher government. Sherman would come in and say there'd be some huge debate on rail transportation, and Sherman would simply say, why don't you concrete over the railways and run coaches on them? Okay. And we do need bolder managed experiments. For example, one of the fundamental principles of Conservative policy now is that you don't tax people on the first £9,000 or £10,000 of their income. Now, that was a Lib Dem idea, in fact, which the Cameron government seemed to have sort of stolen from Lib Dem policy. The idea that rather than reducing the tax rate, I would take that further and say you should tax people less in the beginning of their life than you do towards the end. Okay, so that your tax allowance should be to some extent dependent on how much you've earned to date, not treated as an annual allowance. And one of the things I find disappointing, it's easy. I work in creative advertising. It's not a high stakes field in quite the same way, and you can get paid for being a bit of a whack job, right? Okay, I have a cushion, but I am disappointed by there's generally just seems to be a dearth of lateral and oblique ideas in politics. Now, let's take video conferencing, or what we're doing now. I mean, you're in London, I can tell from your offices. I'm in Kent, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this engagement would have required me to board a train and travel across London. It doesn't, Now, this is potentially quite an important technology, Now, it might partly help solve the housing crisis if people can live further from where they work. Not everybody has to be able to do that, just some. It might solve the transport crisis because not everybody is travelling at the same time. It might help solve the pensions crisis because people can work to some degree later in life. I think most people retire because they want to stop commuting, not because they want to stop work, It's a very interesting technology. Now, it doesn't sit with any given ministry or discipline, The Ministry of Transport should really have been giving everybody free Zoom access in 2017. Because but it's called the Ministry of Transport. It's not called the Ministry of not getting people to move about so much. In Finland, they have a ministry which I think is called the Ministry of Transport and Connection, and they do actually look at broadband connections alongside road building. Now, quite often in free capitalist markets, progress comes from completely oblique things. I wrote earlier that the biggest news in home insurance in 30 years was the invention of the oven chip, Because suddenly this profusion of claims from chip fat fires, which required your whole house to be redecorated, even if the house didn't burn down, that suddenly died off. And the insurance industry would have been better off actually paying McCain the money to promote oven chips than attempting to reduce their current insurance premiums. And so I don't think government has much either appetite for or capability for digesting progress which happens in oblique ways. The very ideological fixation on tax rates seems to me fundamentally mentally limiting. It's important. I accept the fact that broadly speaking, you should give people their own money to spend to preserve incentives. But equally, if people would rather spend money on health than they would on sunglasses, and the only way to spend more money on health is to tax people more, we need to have a more intelligent, nuanced debate. Taxing people to pay for what, for example? And so I do think that the fact that everything effectively gets reduced down to this very narrow, polarizing kind of principles, which is pretty badly aligned with what people care about in everyday life, I think that's a problem.
That's it for this week. Remember, if you enjoy what we do here at The Spectator, you can subscribe to the magazine and to our online content. Join today and you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And don't forget to subscribe to The Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.